Birth of the Border, The Impact of Partition in Ireland is Cormac Moore's brand new book. There's some great stuff in it on sport. It's the last chapter of the book, and we're focusing on that this morning with Cormac himself in studio. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Owen.
Let's start with the GAA, because it's the one that probably comes most to mind when you think about the balance between politics and sport in Ireland. Post-partition, how did the GAA reflect on it? I presume it was something that they pushed to one side and ignored when the news initially came through. Yeah,
well, the GAA, as you would imagine, being a nationalist body, as well as primarily a Catholic body as well, were totally anti-partition, vehemently opposed to it. But they did have to accept the reality of it when Northern Ireland was created. And it's actually reflected in Ulster province in particular, in that for the first 20 plus years of Northern Ireland, so from 1921 to the early 40s, very few Ulster football finals were actually played in the 6 counties of the Ulster Championship. They actually were all played in either Cavan or Monaghan, and this actually was reflected in the on the field as well, where Cavan and Monaghan totally dominated. So there was like it really affected people's ability to play games, to organise clubs in 6 counties, because the Ulster, the Unionist government, did believe it was a seditionist organisation, the GAA. So they did everything they could to, like local authorities that were controlled by Unionists, put a lot of obstacles in the way of the GAA to organise games. Famously, the Ulster football final of 1922, the whole Monaghan football team was arrested on the way to that final. Now, there's very strong claims, and they had guns on them, and there's very strong claims that they're not just there to play a football game. They also were there to free 3 prisoners from Derry jail, and that probably is the case. But it actually did escalate the violence in the north in early 1922. The Free State Provisional Government, Michael Collins' Provisional Government, reacted to those kidnappings, to the arrests of those Monaghan footballers by actually kidnapping 40 to 50 loyalists along the border on Tyrone Fermanagh. And it really escalated tensions and led to increased sectarian violence, which had coloured the creation of the North from 1920 to 1922. So the GAA, was many GAA members, like many other Catholics, including people who weren't involved in the IRA, were interned from 1922 to 1924 on the prison ship, the Argenta. So it really affected the GAA as an organisation. But in terms, though, of how the GAA association dealt with partition, they did tend to ignore it. And people in 6 counties asked for a special officer, because they were so affected compared to other jurisdictions and counties in Ireland. They asked for a separate, a special organiser to help grow the game there, because it was so affected. But the Central Council said no, there wasn't going to happen. So,
that's interesting when you think about some of the characters around the GAA at the time. Like Owen O'Duffy would have been Ulster GAA secretary.
Of course,
Like, was there? So you said that there was kind of pleas for a separate Northern Irish or above the border sort of committee set up.
They never used the name Northern Ireland.
That's why I corrected myself there.
Or 6 counties. It was never, and that was obviously official Irish government policy for decades as well, never to use that name Northern Ireland, as if that would magically make it disappear.
Like, was this part of the reason why perhaps people in the south didn't get too involved with it, that there might have been a sense of abandonment in the north?
Well, like
the
whole nationalist minority community in the north would be justified in thinking they were abandoned, not just from a sporting perspective, but also politically as well. And the early years of the Irish Free State would suggest they were right. So yes, the GAA would fall into that category as well. And it was interesting the way they changed their rules as well. So they got rid of their bans on people who joined forces in Ireland, so the Army or the Garda Síochána, but anyone who's in the RUC or the specials were still barred from the GAA. And they also, there was actually a big debate internally within the GAA in 1918, 1919 to anyone who works in the civil service, including teachers, would have to leave their jobs in order to stay in the GAA. They couldn't take an oath to the Crown. But they actually changed that for the North once the partition was created. That any teachers, for example, with the Promissory Oaths Act of 1923, they had to pledge allegiance to the Crown. But the GAA decided to let that drop and that they could stay in the GAA.
It's mad to think what the Ulster Championship would have been had this not been in place, had it been very different, because we think of the great Cavan teams of yesteryear, and like you make the point, you've just made the point there that they were helped greatly by the fact that there were 6 counties in their very championship which were being held back by partition.
Yeah, we don't know what the results would have been if there wasn't all of these obstacles put in the way of the 6 counties. But we do know that Cavan dominated for the first 3 decades of partition, and Monaghan did well too. So and all of the games, the big games, tend to be held in the particularly Monaghan and Cavan, but the 3 counties of Ulster that weren't in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, let's move on to rugby, because it's interesting. It's very different, far more accommodating from Dublin towards those north of the border.
So much says too accommodating for north
that's
of the border.
it. What's your view on it?
Yes, I like most of the rugby's interesting that there were nationalists who played rugby, particularly the further from Dublin you went. But the administrators tended to be unionists in outlook, be it up north or in Dublin. Most of them came from Trinity College, most of them were Protestant, and most of them had a unionist outlook. And a perfect example of that was they refused to play the tricolour in Lansdowne. So they used to have like rugby internationals used to be alternated between Lansdowne Road and Ravenhill in Belfast. In fact, the Dublin organisation, the IRFU, decided not to expand Lansdowne Road, so they actually could build a stadium for Ravenhill. So it was really helping Ulster rugby. But what they decided to do when they held internationals, they decided to play the Union Jack still in Ravenhill. But instead of playing the tricolour, they actually played a 4 provinces, held a 4 provinces flag in Lansdowne Road.
Right.
And the actual Irish Free State government had to intervene and say, you must play the tricolour. So they had no problem playing the Union Jack up in the north, but they did not want to play the tricolour in the south. So there's loads of examples, like they didn't countenance Sunday rugby, which Sabbatarianism is definitely was very strong within the Protestant community. And they did go out of their way to make sure that they accommodated Ulster rugby, and that's one of the main reasons why it never split. It never partitioned.
It's very interesting, just the complete divergence in opinion from the GAA and rugby. Not all that surprising. Like we see in the Gaelic Athlete, which you cite in the book here. This is one of my favourite parts. The Gaelic Athlete depicted soccer and rugby as exotic imitations of Britishness, describing Irishmen who played those codes as blatant imperialists for all Ireland to roll itself up in the Union Jack and sing and toast Irish nationality with a leer on its lying lip, which is great poetry. It's poisonous stuff. It's
well, that was the GAA, though. The GAA tended to sometimes exaggerate things and also exaggerate its own anti-imperialism or anti-partitionist stance, when the truth is often somewhere in between.
Did people, was there kind of a real political feeling within those playing the games at that point? There's clearly been a very strong connection between the GAA and politics. Were people who were picking up a rugby ball in parts of the south of Ireland kind of feeling more sympathetic towards the unionist cause?
Well, it depends on where they came from and how closely they were involved to the violence. But we have to remember that the violence itself, from, say, 1919 to 23, when the Civil War ended, it was in pockets in the country. It wasn't all over the country. Yeah. So if you were in Munster, you couldn't get away from the impact of the wars. But with most parts of the country, you wouldn't. Dublin, they had a lot of instances of violence, but most people went along their daily business as before. So, it didn't affect them that much. Now, there was a cricket game in Trinity College, Dublin, in 21, and it was between the gentlemen of Ireland versus the gentlemen of the military. And the IRA shot in from the gates on Nassau Street, and a woman got hit and got killed, a spectator, Kathleen Wright. She was engaged to be married. So, that's where kind of the violence impacted on people either playing or watching games. That was a particularly sad incident. And there was
cricket is very interesting because we had Paul Rouse in a few months ago talking about the history of cricket, going back to how it was Ireland's most popular game in the mid-19th century.
Exactly, yeah.
But amongst both classes, amongst both religions.
You go to Tipperary and Kilkenny, maybe that's why they're so good at hurling. Cricket was huge in those counties in the mid-19th century. And it was played by both religions. But that did change, though, over the decades. That did change. As the Irish Ireland movement grew in popularity, and the GAA introduce its foreign games bans, which only included 4 sports, by the way, the foreign games bans, which was rugby, soccer, hockey, and cricket. So it wasn't really foreign games; it was British games that it was against. But yeah, cricket did see itself retreating, I suppose, in terms of popularity within the nationalist Catholic community. That by the partition, the onset of partition, it was primarily a Protestant upper class sport.
That changed things.
It did. Well, I would suggest that cricket was not governed as an All-Ireland body. There was an Irish Cricket Union, but the Northern Cricket Union refused to join it.
Okay.
For decades, they felt they were being unfairly treated, a bit like what the South, the Leinster felt in soccer, in that there was a bias, there was a Dublin bias in terms of cricket, that all the venues were either in Dublin or in Bray or in Munster. Most of the international teams or the Gentlemen of Ireland teams were based in the South. So they didn't want to get involved in an Irish Cricket Union, but they changed literally after partition, which was unusual. The Irish Cricket Union actually became united after partition in the early 20s because there was a real effort by Leinster to make sure that Ulster would join, Northern Cricket Union would join. They started giving them representation on the Irish cricket team. They started giving them games up in Belfast. So, they really made an effort to make sure that the Ulster and the Northern team was accommodated.
Is it fair to say that the organisation that managed partition best was the IABA? Like, I know they were operating on a smaller scale than the GAA in rugby, but just from reading the chapter, and you cannot judge anything on what happens a century later, but obviously the continued success on both sides of the divide is something that's been notable from Irish boxing. It's been notable on rugby as well, but we've already discussed it. It seems that IABA managed to maintain something of a status quo. Yeah,
they did. For sports like rugby, hockey, bowls, cricket, and even the GAA, it was easier for them to stay united because the people in the sport were generally from the same group. There was a homogeneous group in terms of either Catholic or Protestant. They're the same mix of people basically that play those games. But then you have boxing, which is very like soccer. It's very popular within the Protestant and Catholic communities, and there was never a question of boxing dividing. And they always felt they should be united. And even the fact that the security forces, who politically and security-wise would have had nothing to do with each other, but when it came to boxing competitions, which they had a huge part in, like Owen Duffy, as we mentioned earlier, he was very heavily involved in boxing as well. The Gardaí would actually go up over the border to competitions, and the same with the RUC. And what the IABA did as well, which was a lot of sports that remained united did, they gave more devolution to the different provincial councils, like Ulster, like Connacht and Leinster. So they allowed them to be semi-autonomous in terms of running their own affairs, but then they would gather together in terms of international competitions and national competitions as well. Yeah,
it's amazing how that managed to progress through the decades as well, with these almost unthinkable sporting events.
Remember Wayne McCullough, a lad from a Protestant lad from Belfast, bring out tricolour in the '92 Olympics. So that would have been unheard of, obviously, in soccer. So it just shows what boxing has contributed and what boxing contributed to the peace process as well. In recent times. So it is an incredible cross community involvement that sport has had.
Really is. We'll finish with football, and I cannot believe that there was some internal politics going on in the IFA.
Could you believe it? In this week of weeks, in terms of the FAI, there's internal problems. Before I start, I've done a lot of research on soccer split. It was my last book, The Irish Soccer Split, and a lot of people, like previous historians, previous commentators, assumed because soccer split in 1921, the same year Ireland was partitioned, that it was because of the political partition. And just from further research and from many years' research now, yes, of course it increased tensions, the political goings-ons, and there was definitely incidents that were related to the political turmoil in Ireland at the time. But at the root of the division in soccer is, without doubt, the internal politics of the IFA. So, for listeners and viewers, the IFA was an All-Ireland body. The Irish Football Association, founded in 1880. It was so for over 40 years. But the people in Leinster, in Dublin in particular, felt there was a Belfast bias in terms of selection of players, selection of venues, And even coffers, the distribution of finances, the representation on the different IFA council committees, as well as the IFA council, and this was going on for decades. There was loads of points where the Leinster Football Association could have left the IFA, but it reached a boiling point in 1921 when Shelbourne, who the IFA decided that year that no games would be held in Dublin because of the violence, even though there was as much violence in Belfast as there was in Dublin at the time. So Shelbourne went up to Belfast for a Irish Cup semi-final game against Glenavon, a Lurgan-based team. And that game was a draw, so the natural assumption was it would be held in Dublin, the replay. But the IFA said no, Shelbourne had to go back up again. And they said no, they weren't going to do it. The Leinster Football Association backed him, and with that the FAI was born. And now, what shows to me as well that it was all to do with internal politics was that for the following decade, from 1921 to 1932, there were a number of conferences, there was a lot of correspondence between the IFA and FAI to try and heal the division, to try and reunite, particularly when it came to one international team. And so the IFA never wanted to just be governed for the 6 counties. Yeah. They always felt they were an all-Ireland body, that they were the national body of the whole island of Ireland, even though they did ignore huge parts of Ireland. And the FAI never wanted to be a partitionist body either. They in their first few years, they had 23 teams from the Falls Road, the Falls District League. In fact, one of the teams, Alton United, won the FAI Cup in 1923. So they weren't a partitionist body either. But the FIFA involvement and even the other British associations made it transpire that they did become partitionists in many ways. But it was internal politics that was the main driver of that division.
Yeah, it certainly was. Just before we wrap up, like you mentioned the Irish soccer split there, 2015, I think you wrote that book,
Yeah.
So obviously a lot has happened since then, both in politics and in footballing politics. I know obviously there's been the documentary done since then on RT as well, which you were part of, I think, which has obviously happened post-Brexit. But like it is interesting thinking about how much has even changed since you put pen to paper on that book. And even if we just keep it to football politics for a moment, like to talk with the All-Ireland League this year, how our own football association in the South anyway is falling to pieces at the moment.
Yeah, it is. It's tragic. But is it that surprising though, the way the organisation's been run? It probably is the extent to which it's falling apart is somewhat surprising. But
you wonder to yourself if there was ever. I'm sure you were thinking to yourself when writing the book. Is there ever a point? And you were asked as well on the show, I remember. Is there ever a point in the future when things might actually go back to the way they were? Like, if there's any point it's going to happen, you'd imagine that date is fast approaching when somebody is actually thinking about it, because our football matters in the Republic of Ireland anyway are a bit of a mess.
Yeah, it's hard to say because unfortunately logic often hasn't come into it when it comes to the FAI and IFA on this matter of whether it is. I think the FAI have always entertained the idea of having an All-Ireland team at least. The IFA are a bit more reluctant, even though they did have conferences during the 70s, during the height of the Troubles, to have an All-Ireland team. So, it can happen. I've always believed, and I still do believe, that I think we're going to qualify for Euro competitions in the future, simply by the fact that half of Europe qualifies from here on in. So it's going to be hard not to in some years. Although I'd say there's a good chance. Well, obviously, one of the Irish teams will not be qualifying in March. But the World Cup's where it's really going to be seen, because you're going to have, like, in future, this anti-democratic way that Europe and South America have so much teams is going to change. And you're going to see a lot more power coming in within Africa and Asia. So you're going to have European teams squeezed out of the competition, the World Cup competition, and you're going to have African and Asian teams getting a lot more places. And that's going to make it practically impossible for 2 Ireland teams have a chance of qualifying for the World Cup. So that might, lack of success, I think, might drive the 2 teams to think about having an Irish international team. I can't see in the the long distant future. If we have 2 Irish teams, either of them qualifying for a World Cup competition. So that's where we might see it. It's still a long way off, and it may never happen. Like, it's 100 years now almost since the split has happened, and there have been loads of attempts to heal it, and there's loads of justifiable reasons to heal it. But look at the IFA, for example. With the national anthem. If they were really serious about including the nationalist community in their team and in their support, should they still be playing God Save the Queen as a national anthem? And they refuse to discuss that issue.
Yeah. The final question, and it's probably the most complicated one, is you mentioned almost 100 years on since this. It's a question that's come up, something that's been thrown out there. How do you view sport in Ireland if one day there was a United Ireland once again? What would happen to these organisations? Would it be for better or for worse? Because as we can see from your chapter in this book, the impact after partition was fairly significant.
Yeah, but in sport, yeah, it did affect all sports, but most sports are all-Ireland bodies, so if there was a United Ireland, they would continue on as before. So soccer and athletics are the two main sports, and motor racing as well. Are the main sports that were partitioned, and soccer is the one that sticks out. So, I would see there would have to compromise on flags and anthems and different emblems, and there may be less jobs for people in the FAI and IFA. But I think it would be very straightforward, to be honest with you. I think people in the South certainly would support. Most people would support an All-Ireland team. Not so much in the North, but it still is. There's been a lot of polls done, and there's been a majority support for an All-Ireland team in the North as well. Even about 40% in the Protestant community, which I found quite surprising. So I think an All-Ireland team in a United Ireland would be the least of the problems the United Ireland would have to worry about.
Yeah, I think that's a conversation for another day, all those other problems. Yeah. It's called Birth of the Border, the Impact of Partition in Ireland, and I guarantee you, if you pick it up for Christmas, you'll learn something new pretty much every page. Cormac Moore, thanks a million for popping in.
Cheers.